Arif Hasan wrote 10,000 or so words about quarterback clutchness. Let's discuss whether it's real and why Joe Burrow has some evidence that he is, in fact, a very clutch quarterback.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, joined today by Arif Hasan. You can find his work on Wide Left, where he's done some really fantastic work. Really enjoyed that subscription myself personally, the Norse Code podcast. He's also on the Locked On Network, Locked On Sports Minnesota, a co-worker joining us today to talk about quarterback clutchness on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcast, and we appreciate all of you out there who make us your first listen and who make us an everyday part of your routine. Arif, today we're going to dive into this concept that, as you write about extensively, is largely perhaps a product of creative writing as on the part of the media, looking for narratives to create over time about players that have success, and this idea that there are some quarterbacks who may or may not be clutch. And you've done a lot of research on this. You talked to some other statisticians and did your own analytic approach. Talk about what inspired this project and how you went about formulating your own methodology here.
Yeah, I mean, first it's like the off season, right? So I had to come up with something. But I'd been doing like a little bit of work for the SB Nation site for the Chargers, Bolts from the Blue. And one of the things that has been kind of circulating around Justin Herbert is like, is he clutch or not? Which is like an interesting question because his rookie year is characterized by a ton of fourth quarter comebacks. But since then, people, I guess, have come up with this idea that maybe he's not clutch. And I was really curious about that. And so I wrote a little bit about it over there. But I was like, this is like a larger, like, is that like a real thing, right? Because I know that in baseball, know that in basketball, there's a lot of discussions about whether this is real, replicable, something that we should take into account when we're evaluating players. And I remember from like baseball discussions, not that I'm like a huge baseball fan, that, there's a lot of statisticians that just don't believe in it. And from there, I was like, well, I could probably write about this from a football perspective. Have there been studies that have looked into it from a football perspective? And the answer was largely, aside from kickers, no. So from there, I just kind of looked into it, downloaded some data. I have no statistical training, so hopefully someone who's good at numbers will also take a crack at it. But I ran a bunch of different types of data to try and see if we could find something. And then I was like, I should probably talk to people who are good at running data. So then I asked them. So that's how the piece came about, because it was like a Justin Herbert talker in the offseason, because it's the offseason. And I generally regard Herbert as a pretty good quarterback. And so I was like, well, the only way I can figure out if somebody's good at this is to see if everybody else is good at this and then compare. So I got a bunch of data for a bunch of quarterbacks. Some of the data goes back to 1966, which is like really fun and exciting. And then some of it is the PFF era, which goes back to, I think, technically 2006. I didn't want to go back that far, but there you go.
That's a pretty cool idea. And, they say comparison is a thief of joy. Some people say, Arif. But when we're discussing sports, there needs to be comparison to understand context and where players fit in when stacked up against one another. And the other thing that I found really interesting, or maybe the most interesting part, before we talk about Joe Burrow specifically, which we will, because he comes out pretty well in a lot of these metrics that you looked at, except for one, which suggests perhaps he's one of the less lucky clutch quarterbacks out there. But one of the most interesting things for me conceptually was this idea that, well, are quarterbacks like Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow actually clutch, or are they just good? And the quarterbacks that we tend to think are clutch quarterbacks historically, who have the, you can't give them 30 seconds at the end of the game kind of aura about them, or, you score to go up 3 and there's 2 minutes left in the game, you're pretty sure the other quarterback is going to win. These quarterbacks are going to win. they're just some of the good quarterbacks, right? And so the idea that you need to distill what is in fact clutch from, is this just a good quarterback continuing to be good in a time that we define as a clutch time? That was one of the more interesting concepts that I think would challenge a lot of natural or inherent ideas of what is clutch.
Yeah, no, I think that is like a crucial element to this question, right? Is when we see a good quarterback perform an excellent comeback, is that inherent, an additional trait they have on top of all of the other things that make them a good quarterback. And this is essentially the Tony Romo question, right? Like the inverse of it, right? So there's the Tom Brady side and the Tony Romo side. And, both very good quarterbacks. Obviously, I think, over the course of regular season play and regular play, Tom Brady's better. But Tony Romo was a very high quality quarterback that was given a label of being particularly unclutch. And so is that a trait that Tony Romo lacked, or is it a combination of other factors, right? And what I found was that generally speaking, great quarterbacks are also great in the clutch. When you attempt to predict how good a quarterback is going to be in the clutch, and you have all of this data, right? You have all of their performances in non-clutch situations, all of their performances in clutch situations, and then non-clutch 2-minute situations, which I thought was a really important element because those are different strategic considerations. You could be good at being a quarterback, but not good at the 2-minute drill, and that has nothing to do with your response to pressure. I think that when you distill all of that down, I find that there is some evidence from a repeatable standpoint that some quarterbacks are better in the clutch than other quarterbacks once you account for their skill level, but it is really small. Primarily, you want to be good at being a good quarterback before you want to be good at being clutch in order to be good in the clutch, if that makes sense. So I found that in predicting clutchness, it's about 7 times more important to be good in all scenarios than it is to be good in clutch scenarios in order to see if you'll be good in clutch scenarios in the future. So primarily you want to be a good quarterback. There is some evidence to suggest that clutchness plays a role, but it's a small enough role that I agree. I asked a couple of statisticians. Timo Risky over at PFF said, it may or may not be a thing, but I would rather have a non-clutch Peyton Manning in a clutch situation than a clutch Sam Darnold in a clutch situation. So if you gave me Peyton Manning for the whole game, and then in the final 2 minutes with one score down, I was asked to pick a quarterback, and one of them was a clutch quarterback that was bad throughout his whole career, and one was a non-clutch quarterback that was phenomenal throughout his whole career, I'd take that second one. And my data shows that that's the correct decision, right? That you would want a good quarterback first and foremost before you have someone who rises to the occasion. The perfect example of this is Mark Sanchez, who rose to the occasion more than almost any other quarterback in my data while also being a bad quarterback. And his clutch performance is above average, like if you just look at PFF grades, and his clutch differential, how much he improved versus the clutch, was one of the best that I've seen. And you still don't want him in those two. You'd rather have Peyton Manning. You'd rather have Tony Romo, right? So, so these small differences, like maybe that's the difference between, Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. I would suggest that there's another degree of difference just from pure talent, but you take a guy that a lot of people think is number 1, a guy that a lot of people think is number 2. I know I'm on a Bengals podcast, so I don't want to say definitively that Josh Allen's the second best quarterback, but a lot of people think that he is, right? And if you take those two and say, hey, there are some differences in regular play, but when you look in the clutch, man, Patrick Mahomes is way better. Yes, but it kind of doesn't matter that much how much better he is, because the impact of that versus the impact of his overall talent level is very small. So, yeah, it exists. It kind of doesn't matter.
And then you have elements like luck that seems to play a pretty big factor in some of these conversations as well. Let's continue this discussion by focusing in on the specific metrics and what some of those specific metrics think about Joe Burrow, the Cincinnati Bengals quarterback, who we're pretty sure is clutch. And let's discuss why coming up next. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by FanDuel, who knows that you love sports. I love sports as well. They're one of the greatest things that we get to do to entertain ourselves. But with the lack of many major sports at this part of the year, it can be a little bit challenging to find all of the sports content that you want. But FanDuel knows that you can keep the sports going whenever you want. And all you have to do is open the app and dream up the bets that you want to place anytime you're in the mood. And right now, in this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. If you're looking at football futures, the Cincinnati Bengals still have the fifth best odds in the NFL to win the Super Bowl this year. But you can get that at plus 1,400. That's pretty good odds if you believe the Bengals will get it done this year. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Arif, let's discuss how Joe Burrow fits in to what you found and the various metrics that you tried to use to determine what is a clutch quarterback. I know you've got some win probability differences and PFF grading differences. What did you find to be the most compelling pieces of evidence? And let's talk about where Joe Burrow stacked up in those pieces.
Sure. Well, I do want to start with the most dramatic and least compelling form of evidence that we have about clutchness, which is fourth quarter comeback win percentage, right? That's the one that people always look at when they're talking about. They don't even look at percentage. It'd be nice if they did, honestly. They just look at total fourth quarter comebacks, which is, I think, silly, right? Because if you're very good, you're in very few fourth quarter comeback situations. But, I think that for people that are focused on wins, they would want, fourth quarter comeback percentage. But there's a lot of ways to be clutch, late in one score games. So we focus a lot on that dramatic type where someone engineers a comeback in the final moments to produce a win out of like a lost game or a game where they're down 2 scores, 1 score, whatever. And, the success rate for teams that are entering the fourth quarter or at any point in the fourth quarter don't have a lead, so tied or losing, is about 19%, which means that the inverse, of course, is 81%. And we only look at that 19%. So if you exceed that 19%, you're beginning to develop a reputation for being clutch. These absurd numbers that we're seeing from like Mahomes and Brady, it's closer to 40. Mahomes is like 48%. It's like close to 50%, which is a crazy statistic. But the problem with that, of course, is that it's just another version of quarterback wins. It's just isolated to the fourth quarter. And so you're reliant on the defense, right, to keep you in the game or to, give you, even to potentially just give you the lead, right? Because of a pick six or something like that, or put you in good field position, right? And you can't account for that with just like the win percentage. But what you find there is that Joe Burrow has one of the lowest fourth quarter comeback rates of any quarterback in the NFL, which, hey, we just talked about, like, the most important thing in being a clutch quarterback is just being a good quarterback. We know Joe Burrow's a good quarterback. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out all of these other factors will impact some quarterbacks more than other, and it just happens to be that Joe Burrow is the most impacted quarterback in this scenario. So there's a couple of ways that you look at it to see if a quarterback individually is performing well in these high leverage situations. And so when I ask these statisticians, like, hey, what do you define as a clutch situation, or what is clutchness? If we could identify it, where would you find it? And their answer was, you perform at or above your baseline level of performance in high leverage situations. So individual plays that are worth more than the plays that occur throughout the rest of the game. So we can imagine some pretty obvious clutch scenarios, right? So it's fourth quarter, there's 25 seconds left on the clock, you have one timeout, and you're in the red zone. That's pretty clutch. You're down a score, you got to score. That's clutch, right? And there's a spectrum of that, right? So in the fourth quarter, early in the fourth quarter, let's say there's 13 minutes left, you're down 2 scores. That's somewhat high leverage, but it's much more important to be good on third down than it is to be on first down. So third down is a much more high leverage situation than first down. And so on and so forth. So you create this range of leverage where the impact of that play is going to have a huge impact on the course of the game. And you identify the highest leverage situations, maybe the 5% most important plays over the course of a season, how that quarterback performs there. Well, there's a couple of ways to look at that, right? So there's yards per attempt, which is a decent proxy, but that's something that I would use maybe 10, 15 years ago. We've got a lot, we've got better statistics now, because if you have 3 of those situations, or let's say 5 of those situations, and you throw an 80-yard touchdown on one of them, and then you throw incompletions on 4 of them, or even an interception on one of them, right? You're probably not clutch, but your yards per attempt is pretty high. So we can look at win probability added, which looks at how much you've changed the likelihood of your team's winning from one play to the next. Pretty simple. So teams historically down 1 score in the red zone on 3rd down with 25 seconds left and 1 timeout, they historically win at, I'm going to throw out a number here, I don't actually know the answer, maybe 35% of the time, right? If you score a touchdown, you've changed your win probability from 35% to probably 95, 98%, something around there. So your win probability added there is about 60%, right? So you do that, you average that over the course of all of your high leverage plays, and you get a win probability added. Well, Joe Burrow is 2nd in the NFL in high leverage performance and win probability added. That's incredible. Oh my God. Okay. Well, there's another way to look at it too. Because, maybe he's benefiting from yards after the catch. Maybe he's benefiting from bad defenses. What's going on here? Well, Pro Football Focus grades, which are not perfect by any means, but are probably better at quarterback than almost any other position, do a pretty good job at isolating the individual quarterback's play. So they account for pressure, sacks, fumbles, plays that should have been interceptions that aren't interceptions, plays that shouldn't have been interceptions that are interceptions, dropped passes, stuff like that, right? And Joe Burrow, of active quarterbacks, has the highest grade of any quarterback in those clutch situations since 2020. Any quarterback. The only guy who's higher is Tom Brady, and he's retired. He doesn't count. Go away. So, but that's interesting. So Joe Burrow, by 2 measures, is the most or the 2nd most clutch quarterback, and by another measure is like certainly the least of the elite quarterbacks. And when you calculate what the expected win probability is, or the expected comeback rate of a quarterback of this caliber is, and then you compare it to their actual comeback rate, the unluckiest quarterback in the NFL is Joe Burrow, who has a comeback rate of below 19%. The only high-level quarterback to have a comeback rate below the NFL average in these scenarios. So, there you go.
So, which of these is predictive, if any? Can we extrapolate from any of this that, yeah, we think Joe Burrow will continue to play well in the clutch, but is the comeback percentage or the expected difference that you're able to calculate, is that something that's sticky?
A little bit. Again, if you create a model for, future comeback rate, the most important input to that model is just how good you are. That's it. Now, generally speaking, if you can isolate it to passing grade, that's better, which is what my model does. But sometimes you don't have access to like PFF passing grade. Sometimes you just get access to win probability added or adjusted net yards per attempt. In that case, do what you can. But with just passing grade, not quarterback or total offense grade, but passing grade, that's better, which is important because Lamar Jackson is a very high-level quarterback that does not perform as well in 2-minute situations. And that's because a lot of his value is added to the running game, which is, self-evidently very good. But in those specific situations is, the fact that he's not as good of a passer as Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow means he's not going to be as good in those situations, which we see bear out in the data. But just being good matters the most. And so when we model that, plus the fact that Joe Burrow has actually been the best quarterback from a PFF perspective in those situations, his expected comeback rate, going forward is close to 35%, almost double the expected NFL average there. And his win probability added in those situations is number 1 in the NFL. And so I was really curious about that. So I went through a bunch of Joe Burrow 2-minute drills, just to see, like, am I crazy? Is there like something here? So I'll talk about those in a little bit, but I suspect we're about to hit an ad break, so I'll let you take care of that.
Yeah, let's discuss those examples, and great transition there to the last segment. We'll wrap up with what Arif found in his specific study, because As with all things football, you can look at box scores and win probability added and expected points added and PFF grades, but a lot of very important evidence is found in just watching the games. And Arif has done that as well. We'll finish up the show there coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, or whatever your vehicle needs. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Not only that, they've got eBay's guaranteed fit, which means your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you will get your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers. Arif, let's talk about some examples. We know that Joe Burrow comes out really well in the stats, except for this mysterious unluck situation. What did you find that explained why Joe Burrow was unlucky?
Yeah, I mean, I think first is that when I'm looking at clutch statistics, I'm including all of high leverage situations where it matters, right? So, like I said, we think of comebacks, but what's really important is also if you're a quarterback in the 4-minute drill, you have to maintain the lead. He's great at that. So his first down rate among 34 quarterbacks of at least 50 attempts in the scenario where you've got the ball late in the game with the lead is 7th in the NFL, 5th when we limit it to at least 75 attempts. So that's about 34 quarterbacks that he ranks 5th of all those quarterbacks in maintaining first downs with a lead.
And is that active quarterbacks? Like what time frame are we talking about there?
Since 2020, okay. Any quarterback. So that it does include, Tom Brady and any other quarterbacks that have thrown at least 50 attempts in that situation, whether or not they're retired. And I believe Tom Brady is above him, so bump him up a slot if you want. Okay, that's great. But also, like, when you look at, when they're losing, right? Down 2 scores with 6 minutes left, down 1 score with 4 minutes left, whatever. Burrow's definitely been more unlucky than bad. So one of his first comeback attempts ever. Well, I remember the 2021 season against the Vikings where he did actually, win that comeback. Back in 2020, against all teams to have a failed comeback attempt, it was the Chargers, which is crazy. In that September 2020 game, Burrow threw a touchdown to A.J. Green, right, down 3 points. But Green was called for offensive pass interference.
Yes, a call that lives in infamy, along with some other pass interference calls in recent Bengals history.
Oh, yeah. Randy Bullock missed the 4th down field goal to tie the game, and that was that. And I believe Dean Blandino said after the game, shouldn't have called it. So it's pretty bad. But that set the stage for a career of excellent performance in comeback situations where he was let down by circumstance. So the most famous example, of course, is the 2022 AFC Championship game against the Chiefs. The refs definitely incorrectly called an intentional grounding penalty while Burrow had the ball with a minute left. His trajectory was altered, and so it shouldn't have been called. He had a ball with a minute left. The teams were tied. Something that after the game, a bunch of former officials, including, again, Blandino, said shouldn't have been called. So after overcoming that intentional grounding penalty, the drive ends because of a Chris Jones sack. It immediately comes off the edge against Andrew Wiley, who doesn't look like he's doing much of anything on that play. And the Bengals special teams unit then gives up a 29-yard return, setting up a 26-yard drive for the Chiefs to get the game-winning field goal. Joe Burrow has very little to do with that, right? And there's endless examples of this, right? 2021 Week 5 against the Packers, Burrow suffered from 2 dropped passes in a tie game to set up a field goal. It was a 57-yard miss, which sets up overtime. In overtime, Tyler Boyd moves the wrong way on an option route, which creates a pick. The Packers do miss that field goal off of that pick, which is crazy. And in the response drive, the Bengals only give Burrow 1 passing attempt. That passing attempt is a 21-yard completion to Jamar Chase. But they continue to run the ball. They set up another field goal. It's another miss. The Packers win on the response drive. That year against the Chargers, again, Down 2 scores. Burrow is harassed with constant pressure. A lot of pressure appears in under 1 second, leading to a sack in under 2 seconds. On first down, a drop on second down. I believe that one was from T. Higgins, if I remember correctly. And a quick throw on third down, which doesn't get the conversion. The play wasn't designed to get the conversion. It was designed to set up a fourth down. That fourth down attempt sees instant pressure. Again, the Bengals lose. Next week against the 49ers, which this one hurts so much. 2-minute drill against the 49ers. 2 incredible throws, phenomenal throws to tie the game, send it to overtime. In overtime, he attempts 2 passes, completes them both for over 20 yards. It's another example where maybe he should throw the ball a little bit more in overtime. But the Bengals choose to focus on the run until a late third down in the red zone. He gets sacked on third and 3 against quick pressure. The Bengals make the field goal, but the defense gives up a touchdown in overtime. Against the Steelers, the Bengals were down 6, so same year. Burrow throws 2 touchdowns to Jamar Chase, but the refs ruled the first one out. I didn't get a high-def replay of that one. I was looking at it on the All-22, but it looked like it was into me. I could be wrong. Either way, he does throw the winning touchdown as the clock expires, as the clock hits 0. But Evan McPherson's point-after attempt is blocked. Yeah. So it gets sent to overtime. I'm sorry, I'm traumatizing all of you. When Burrow gets the ball again for overtime, they march down to the 13-yard line, and McPherson misses wide left. So, apropos for the name of the Substack, Wide Left Football, check it out. They do get another opportunity, but this one's interesting. So I would argue that Burrow is 2 for 3 on what should be game-winning drives. The last play, a sack fumble from Arthur Millette. You could argue that's not Burrow's fault because Millette was an unblocked defender. Maybe the running back should get him. You could also argue it is Burrow's fault because he needs to set the protection or throw hot against that kind of blitz. If you argue it's his fault, he should still be 2 for 3. I would grade him positively in comeback scenarios where they should have won the game before that sack fumble. And there's not all instances where Burrow's innocent. Against Dallas, he threw too short too often in his opportunity there. We know what happened in the 2021 Super Bowl. The fact that Aaron Donald took over doesn't absolve Burrow for how he performed in the final moments. So I guess I would argue it gives us some context for how much Aaron Donald wrecked that game at the end there, but you could argue that there's a good amount of blame to be put on Burrow. And there's some moments where maybe you would give him less credit than he should deserve. I think the Texans game is probably a wash on the film because in the fourth quarter, down 10, I think around 6 minutes or so left, he throws what should be a pick, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen. He does throw a touchdown on that drive, including some just phenomenal dimes. And the reason I call that a wash is because he did tie up the game with 1:33 left, and then the defense gives up a 55-yard drive for the Texans win. So I would argue that
he also threw a touchdown pass that should have won the game to Tyler Boyd in that one, and Boyd just stone cold dropped it.
Yeah, Boyd drops it. So it's when I looked at pressure rate, offensive line win rate, and dropped pass rate, in these situations, none of them were in the extremes, but Burrow suffered from above average rates of all of those. Turnover-worthy play rate to interception rate, he had a disproportionate amount of his turnover-worthy plays turned into interceptions. And so nothing where he's like top 5 in drop rate, top 5 in pressure rate, top 5 in all of these unlucky circumstances. But in all of those measures, he's afflicted by it more than average. And you add all of that up, and that's maybe a reason why his PFF grade is so high and his comeback rate isn't. The Bengals special teams unit has been spectacularly bad over the last 4 years in these situations. Despite how good the Bengals receiving core has been, they've been unclutch, which is another thing that Timo Riske pointed out when I was talking to him about this. Is like, hey, if the quarterback is clutch, but like your 10 other teammates are not, what are you gonna like? All of these people have to respond to psychological pressure. We're only focusing on the quarterback. Well, if anybody's on clutch, I would argue it's like Tyler Boyd, right? Like I think it's an issue where you've got a great receiving core that's not living up to their expectations in these moments, and then the defense, which historically has been pretty good for the Bengals over these past 4 years, has been pretty bad in 2-minute situations. So all of these add together to give you, and again, these happen to all quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. They just happen to Joe Burrow a lot more. And they happen to Patrick Mahomes a lot less. He's got a historically bad receiving core. They drop the ball all the time, but somehow in the final 2 minutes, they don't really. So, like, this happens to all quarterbacks, but It happens to Burrow more than anybody else. And historically speaking, that evens out. Historically speaking, the luck kind of shifts back. And so in those clutch situations, one could expect Burrow to be able to deliver. And again, on the flip side of those coins, when they have the lead, he does deliver. It's really only when they're down one score with 3.5, 4 minutes left, or two scores with 6 minutes left, where it's not actually, materializing.
Right. It's interesting to listen to the examples and how many of those are points where the Bengals pivoted in a direction or learned an important lesson about not taking the ball out of Joe Burrow's hands in certain situations, or, oh, we actually need a punter, or, oh, we need to change this, that, or the other thing, versus some lessons that the Bengals didn't learn, like going back to how they got to the Super Bowl with a very clutch performance from their defense in the second half, holding Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs to very limited offense, which is something I said the Bengals wouldn't be able to repeat, and they did in the Bengals' next win against the Chiefs the next season in the regular season. And then Jesse Bates is no longer on the team, and they've had all these secondary changes. And so it's interesting to hear how some of these examples historically of some of this stuff that you would describe to be bad luck, if you're talking about the quarterback specifically, have led to changes in terms of the team's philosophy or decisions that the team made that may come back to haunt them if they can't find development at certain positions. Arif, appreciate the deep dive, appreciate all of the insight. I'm sure this provides a lot of ammunition for Bengals fans who are constantly hearing that Joe Burrow is carried by his teammates and are constantly hearing about these fourth quarter comeback statistics, because I tell you, that stuff is all over this age of social media. You can find his work on Wide Left Out Football. You can find him on Twitter at Arif Hasan NFL. He does great work covering the entire league. And even though he's a lot of the time talking about the Vikings or Justin Herbert or these other people that and teams that he's talked about on this podcast, he does great work covering the entire league. Arif, appreciate the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We're back still 3 days a week, gearing up for training camp on the podcast. So until next time, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.